and we're in an information war, and you're under attack inside your mind because Moscow knows they can't match us, toe to toe when it comes to military, direct military confrontation. But what they can do is they can corrupt our body politic. They can exert their financial corruption and their kleptocracy, and they can simply change your perception of the world. They can gaslight you and conduct information warfare. Hello and welcome. Strictly speaking, this week is not an episode of On the Edge, but rather a collaboration between myself and a friend of the show, Terrell Jermaine Starr, who puts out his own content on YouTube and Substack and all the rest of it under the title of Black Diplomats. And I highly recommend you checking it out. I've had him here on the show previously and interviewed him, but we're going to turn the tables this time, and he's the one that's going to be interviewing me. And it's nice to talk to a peer, somebody who has spent the time and the expertise, done the hard work to try and understand the region and what's happening here. Being the guest, although, it kind of allows me to expand a little bit further than I would if I were hosting on topics regarding the war, the region, and globally, and also my personal history. So I'm going to let Terrell take it from here.
Oh, I mean, it's been a lot going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shit. The latest news is about the current U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine who resigned. And according to the Wall Street Journal, it's because of disagreements with the Trump administration. Of course she has fucking disagreements with the Trump administration, right? The thing, we're going to talk about what really brought us to Ukraine, and I think it's really important because, when you think about Brink and her, the number one thing I'm thinking about is who her replacement is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Because when in this part of the world, you can't send a donor that contributed millions of dollars. You need somebody that knows what the fuck they're doing.
Yeah.
And I have a gut feeling that the person who's going to replace Ambassador, her name is Bridget Brink.
Yeah,
Bridget Brink. They're not going to know what the fuck they're doing. And that's terrifying. And the reason why it feels so visceral to me is because both of us have been coming to Ukraine and across what was known as the former Soviet Union for a long time. And so we care about this place. We have friendships here that people...
I've been coming here nearly 30 years. I still feel like I'm only scratching the surface. Like I have so much more to learn. And I think you're right. I think Trump is going to send over somebody who is either woefully incompetent and not suited for the job, or who's going to be a sycophant, or who's going to be, one of his lackeys and try to bring MAGA to Ukraine, which is exactly what Ukraine doesn't need, because MAGA is all about deciding who's a good American and who isn't a good American. And so much of the tragedy and blood in Ukraine is who's a good Ukrainian and who's a bad Ukrainian. Normally, it's divide and conquer from Moscow. So I have concerns about that. Absolutely, I'm worried about all that.
But do you think that's going to work here, though? I don't...
No, it won't, but I don't think the Trump administration cares. I don't think the Trump administration wants to see Ukraine be successful. So if they do send somebody over here who's incompetent, or somebody who comes over here without the understanding of how to approach Ukraine with its history, with its culture, with the current political makeup, with the pressure that it's under from Moscow and has been for centuries, and if they don't understand all those nuances, they're going to be fumbling around and for example, we had the story recently as well about the Trump administration reaching out to opposition members against Zelensky in the form of
Fucking Yulia Tymoshenko
Yulia
and Petro
Poroshenko, who are the
yeah.
past. That is the past of Ukraine. That those political figures are they're in the rearview mirror. So for them to even be talking to those guys, it's like you're talking to the wrong people, man. So I agree with you. I think that he's going to send somebody over here who doesn't understand a damn thing about what's going on.
But it's also incompetent because Poroshenko got his ass beat in 2019 with 75% of the vote against him. And then Yulia is polling around, 5% on a good day, depending on what poll you're looking at. And, it makes me wonder what conversations are being had in these national security meetings. I just Yulia Tymoshenko and Petro Poroshenko. But there's also something else too that's really important, is that this country is vastly different from the days of Viktor Yanukovych, back from when I first came here in 2009. Culturally, just the whole landscape of this place is unrecognizable from even 10 years ago, let alone the 15 or 16 years ago when I first arrived.
Yeah, well, they tried it in the Orange Revolution in 2004, and then that got undermined by Moscow. With the
Yushchenko.
The folks who even keep a cursory eye on this thing, remember, they tried to poison the guy. So they put down an attempt at breaking away from imperial rule from Moscow once. It failed.
Yeah, they tried. So for those who don't know, basically he was poisoned.
Yeah, he was poisoned.
And actually that emboldened Ukrainians. And so I think the larger point is that we are used to dealing with a psychopathic colonial genocidal nation literally on our borders. Yep. And I think that there's some arrogance or hubris with American politicians that think, okay, they'll do what we say. And even with the Biden administration, I don't even think they adequately understood Ukraine.
Well, see, this is the other. No, I agree with you. I don't think they did understand Ukraine, and I think that they were only looking at Ukraine through their own selfish kind of prism. I don't know what was good for the West and all the rest of it. But the thing that happened in 2014 that I don't think a lot of people realized is that it wasn't just a rejection of Moscow; it was a pursuit of sovereignty. And I remember all the guys that run around with their conspiracy theories about Victoria Nuland, like pulling the strings and like.
They give that woman far too much power than she actually had, and also what that freaking recording actually was.
Well, and also how did that recording see the day of light, and who benefited from it? Nobody asked that question, nor with the Podesta drops, by the way. But that's another issue. But what I think was so important for so many people to understand, both in Brussels and in Washington, is that Maidan, from my perspective, was this rejection of being a colony. Well, this idea of like we get to determine our future. And the future was we want to have closer economic ties with the West, not with the East. That's our decision to make. It is not a subjugation to Brussels or London or New York. It is our decision, and we as a democratic country and now newly sovereign from living under Moscow's empire, we are going to beat our own path. And Americans haven't realized that. I think some Europeans are waking up to this idea, although I think they're also still kind of playing with seeing Ukraine as a pawn in a larger chess game of empires, which they shouldn't be doing because that's counterproductive.
Well, they are colonial imperial nations.
They still have the mindset in Europe,
right?
In Western Europe. Yeah, that is true. But it's like Professor Snyder puts it. That all imperial powers kind of have to have a war in which they lose their imperial war, because then they have to look internally. And Russia still hasn't done that. So they need a good trouncing here. But when it comes to this concept of empire, we see it in Washington and we see it from London and Brussels, that they kind of see Ukraine as part of this imperial or this game between empires. And if I had any message to send to those guys, to that leadership, it's like, you don't realize what it means for these people to break away from colony and colonization, and how important it is for them to have their own identity after centuries of occupation.
I'll tell you how I got into becoming a journalist over here, because I'm interested in your story as well. So, because I think that informs this whole conversation about how we view these Western nations as, this conversation about what it means for a place like Ukraine to break away from colony. And so I was 20 years old. This is back in 2000. And I was at Philander Smith College, a historically black school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And every summer I was looking for something to do because, I didn't have any parents at that point, and my grandmother who raised me died and everything. So every summer I need to look for something to do. And I applied for a summer volunteer program, and to go someplace in the summer of 2001. And on the application, it asks you, hey, we will send people around the world free of charge. Where would you like to go? I chose all the black places, right? I chose Jamaica, I chose Ghana, I chose several countries in the continent of Africa, and I think I chose China or something like that. And there was nothing in Europe at all. And when I got the acceptance letter, it said Russia. I'm like, I don't want to go to Russia.
Russia in 2000?
In 2000, but actually I went in 2001. I eventually went, but keep in mind, I didn't know anything about this place. Mm-hmm. And I had all the typical stereotypes about Russia, that it's cold, and I knew where it was on the map, but as far as the type of things that we're talking about, I had no clue of it at all because I wasn't planning on doing it. So I went there, and I'll never forget. It was, first of all, I went to Moscow, and I didn't appreciate how vast. It just feels like a vast place. It's an enormous place, but more specifically, it feels like you're just dropped into a place, and it just feels like it can go on and on and on and on. It feels as if I've never been out of space, but in outer space, but it feels like if you just keep going, there's no end to it. That's how huge Moscow feels. Yeah. And so, but so I'll tell you I didn't learn anything about colonialism or anything like that.
Oh,
sure. I didn't know any at all because I was volunteering in an orphanage. And so I was volunteering in an orphanage about 6 hours south of St. Petersburg. And that was when I was first introduced to Chechens and Chechnya. And so a lot of the children at this orphanage came from Chechnya because the kids were saying, hey, I'm from Chechnya. And I'm like, what is that? And so long story short, I spent my summer there. There are a couple things that stood out to me. One, I saw, at least in Moscow and Petersburg, I saw Confederate flags. That was really odd to me. I'm like, in Russia, you all have Confederate flags. Why? And so immediately, I was just really nervous. And of course, I was with two other white students, and there are just certain things about race that I saw, but they didn't see. And so, after I left, though, I really learned a lot about Russia after I left because I eventually went to Georgia as a Peace Corps volunteer, the country of Georgia. Mm-hmm. And so it was there where they were saying that, hey, when we go to Russia, we're considered black. I'm like, really? Mm-hmm. And I didn't know. And keep in mind, I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and I understand race from being an American. But then when I went to Georgia and the Caucasus, that's when I really learned how race functions outside of the United States. And it just blew my mind that these people who I think would look white in the United States, one, they don't perceive themselves to be that in their own, for one, and then they don't, because of their sphere of influence is Russia and it dominates them. And so when I was there as a Peace Corps volunteer, this is 2003, we had the Rose Revolution. That was when Mikhail Saakashvili was in power, and the whole conversation was around, will Russians send troops to fire into the crowds, or will they okay the then President Shevardnadze to fire into the crowds? And Shevardnadze didn't do it, long story short, and then Saakashvili became president. And so that's when we learned about this shift, moving away from this these old Soviet leaders who are aging and dying in office to this young, democratic, Western-leaning leadership. And so from that point forward, I knew that I wanted to be a journalist to really document this stuff, but not because of the politics, but I was really drawn to how people were engaging me because I was the only Black volunteer in Georgia, and I just knew the conversations that the Georgians were having with me were just vastly different that they were having from my fellow volunteers, and it wasn't anything negative. They just spoke to me in a way that they felt that I would understand their history and their struggle. Now, I eventually did, but I had to get over my own thinking about how race works and stop looking at them as white in the way that I would look at them in the United States. And that really set me up for how I'm able to cover Ukraine. Because in order for us all to appreciate empire and to appreciate all these themes that we're talking about, we got to step outside of our own knowledge base. You got to be willing to say, okay, I'm ignorant about this and I need to appreciate them. And when I'm in, so my foundation of talking about Ukraine, it actually started in Georgia. And I realized, wow, we spend so much time talking about Western imperialism that these other forms of imperialism exist. This colonialism exists. Russia, how big and vast it is not by accident. That's empire. And from Siberia is not indigenous Russian land, right? And I didn't realize that these, like Central Asia was annexed and, first under the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, look at the people out in the east of Russia, like the Chukchi, have more in common with Native Americans because they crossed over the Bering Strait, back in, millennia in the past. But it's funny to me that you say you were kind of shocked by the Russian sense of empire, because Russian empire is slightly different than Western European empire or American empire. They really think that they are like a benevolent empire, and but then you go and you talk to a Georgian and you talk to a Ukrainian, and they're like, they're not. No, hell no, they're not benevolent. They're not. They're not bringing civilization to what they call their near abroad. They're thugs. They. I always make the point between Ukraine and Russia, and one of what I think are the the one that's kind of an inflection point that divides them into two is that Ukraine is multicultural. As a result of empires kind of crossing through here, and this being kind of like handed between empires, and so the influences and the ethnicities are kind of left behind. Moscow became an empire by conquest, and so its dominance as they grew and they absorbed other cultures and forced them to, you're now part of our empire and we'll pretend to respect your culture, but at the end of the day, remember that we are first among equals here in Moscow. And I think that may have been the way of empire in the past. Like you could see that with the Brits or the English and like the Irish. But, that having lost their empires, they kind of have a different way of doing empire now, where it's kind of more soft power or corporate power or things like that. No, this is old-fashioned empire when it comes to the Russian Empire. This is like, you're going to speak Russian. We are going to change your history books. We are going to change your, sense of self, your sense of identity, and all of that. That's still alive and well when it comes to the Russian Empire.
I remember during a visit to Georgia, I met this Nigerian guy who ended up settling there, and he married a Georgian woman. And this was maybe 2009 or 2010, something like that. And I was curious about what this Nigerian step parents or in-laws, thought about him. And I'm thinking maybe, hey, they didn't accept him. And he said, well, the parents are actually cool with it. And I said, okay, I would like to meet them. And he took me to his house. But they both took me to their home because they were living with the parents. And I was just curious. I said, hey, what did you think about this guy when your daughter brought him home? And the mom was like, I don't care, it's her life. And then the father had a more in-depth response. And he said, let me tell you something. When I was a student and I traveled from Tbilisi to Moscow, they sold us this whole idea of we were this multicultural land and everyone is united and equal and embraced. And he said they treated us like dogs. And they said that in our books, they say that all of the Soviet Union, we're united, we're multicultural and everything. And he was like, this is all bullshit. And he said, I never felt like I was equal to them. And they never treated me like I was an equal. He said for 4 years when I was at university, I felt like a dog because they treated me like a dog. And as soon as I finished my degree, I came back to Georgia. It was under the Soviet Union, but at least it was his home, even though it was occupied. And so the way that he talked about the Soviet Union was one of being trapped. And he said that even when he was in university, the books were were filled with propaganda that he just stopped reading them. And he was able to read books from the West that were smoking in, so he could really learn the truth about the rest of the world. And so he said, I would never want to treat another human being that way. So I really don't care who my daughter brings home as long as he treats her well and he's respectful. I really don't care. And so I've spent all my life under the Soviet Union being racialized, and I'm not going to do that to anyone else. And that really opened up my mind about it.
That's a great story, and it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I guess if you're a colonized subject of one empire or another, you kind of have empathy for other peoples who've been subjected to empire and colonization. I remember when I was living in, so I started covering Moscow in the late 90s during the very, very tail end of the Yeltsin period. And even back then, there was, we used to go to a movie theater that showed films that were in the original English, and they had Russian subtitles, so we could actually enjoy the film. We just sit there and watch an English language film. But right next door to the place that had the theater was this market for primarily Tajik merchants from Central Asia. And almost like clockwork every month, you could bet on there being just an arbitrary raid, that they would just come through, beat people, break their stalls. They said it was cracking down on criminalization, which kind of sounds a little bit familiar for an American. That you're not really wanted here. You're obviously you're criminals, you're rapists, and some, I suppose, are good people. But that was the mentality. And they would go through this market once a month and crack it. And it wasn't so much as like disrupting their business or cracking down on criminality. It was very simple. It was very clear what they were doing. Know your place. Know your place. I mean, it's like Tulsa, It's that kind of mentality. And so I've been covering them ever since then with that understanding. But I started going to the other, former parts of the Russian Empire, whether it was here in Ukraine or Georgia, which I love as well, or the Baltics or Central Asia. It's funny the lies that the Russians tell themselves, and that they were benevolent and that everybody loved being part of the Soviet Union. Well, sure, if you were from Moscow or St. Petersburg, but if you were from Zaporizhia, or if you were from Batumi or Dushanbe, not so much. So anyhow, so then along came 9/11, and I got swept up in those wars and spent the better part of the next kind of decade and a half bouncing around, Iraq, Afghanistan, all that stuff. But after, I was here during Maidan, and on Maidan, people were like, the Russians will not let us go. They're not just going to leave. They're not just going to peacefully say, oh, okay, Ukraine, you've decided to go down a different path. That'll be fine. So the people on Maidan in 2014 were like making me promise, like when the Russians come back, not if, when. Promise us you won't forget about us. And after COVID and getting fired by Fox, which was one of the proudest days of my life, I kind of was reassessing what I was going to do post-COVID. And then this kicked off. And it was like, well, I promised on Maidan. So I came back and like you, I've been here pretty much the entire time of the last 3 years.
So what is it that keeps you here? Because both of us, we're independent. And to me, it requires a particular amount of dedication to want to be here, and to even in a place like Kyiv, which is relatively
as safe as you can get.
As safe as you could get relatively, it still takes a certain amount of commitment, because even when the Shaheeds buzz, I remember, I don't know if it was a couple weeks ago when we had that massive drone attack. I literally heard the buzz and the motors. You recognize them.
Oh, yeah.
And I slept through it.
Yeah.
And but I question myself, because I love the place, but I could love it from New York. But I don't want to. And I don't think I ever asked you, why do you choose to be here? Because there's so many ways that you could support Ukraine from the United States.
I could be lobbying on the Hill. I could be, you're absolutely right. Part of it is that incident on Maidan. I mean, it was a really emotional moment. And I'll tell you what, since we're pals,
Yeah.
I'll tell you the story. This is a story I don't tell often because I can sometimes get rather emotional about it. We were on Maidan and in 2014, and a buddy of mine who was a Polish cameraman for, I think it was ABC at the time, he came into town, and I'd already been here for about 2 weeks. And I said, let's go down from the hotel. We'll go down into Maidan. I'll walk you around. I'll show you where the different encampments are. You know, these are the Georgians over here. These are the kind of privy sector guys who at that time were far more right-wing than they are now. These are the kind of young Europeans. This is non-Ukrainians who've kind of come in, or these are the guys from Kharkiv. These are the guys from Odessa. And we did all that. And then we were walking back to the hotel, and these two old women stepped out of the darkness, out of the shadows and the smoke and everything, because Maidan was crazy. And they stopped us and they said, "Are you foreign journalists?" And we both said, "Yeah, we are." And they immediately broke down in tears and were begging us, please, nie zabывай нас, don't forget about us. Please, 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 don't forget about us. The Russians will come. Don't forget about us. And we're all in tears. Everybody's in tears. I'm in tears. My Polish cameraman friend are in tears. These two little old ladies who, if I close my eyes, I can see them. They're in tears. The whole thing is incredibly emotional. And finally, we kind of break away from them, and we're walking back up the hill to go back to the hotel. And we're walking in silence for a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes. And I finally turned to my buddy, and I'm like, what the hell was that? And he says to me, how old do you think those ladies were? I'm like, I don't know, man. The 70s, maybe even early 80s. I don't know. I mean, they were old. Think about what their life was like. Think about what they've lived through.
Yeah.
You know, and they might have been, you know, they might have gone through at the very early beginning of their lives the Second World War. Certainly, they went through, you know, NKVD or KGB repression and the repression of Ukraine, and then, you know, all the chaos. They've had tough lives, man, and they don't want their children to see the same thing. And when I kind of had that, you know, chance to kind of reflect on what I just promised these two old ladies, I kind of went, well, I guess I'm obligated now, you know, because if you know anything about this culture, there's something about old women.
Yeah.
That are kind of the backbone of the country or of the culture. And it's not just here in Ukraine, but kind of pan-Slavic. Yeah. So I didn't feel like I was just making a promise to these two little old ladies. I was kind of making a promise to Ukraine. And I always loved Ukraine. I've been coming here since 2001 when Pope John Paul II came here. And it was always just such a nice reprieve from Moscow. You get on a train in Moscow, go overnight, you wake up in Kiev, and it's like, okay, so these people aren't schizophrenic, and these people don't have an imperial mentality, and these people have a different culture and a different value system. So I always fell in love with Ukraine, but it was Maidan that cinched it for me. So when the full scale happened, again, I'd kind of been hoping to move away from doing news. I've covered over a dozen wars. I've seen refugee camps. I've seen stuff that, I'll live with for the rest of my life. And I was hoping I would go and do documentaries about Yosemite Valley or the Pacific Coast Highway or, the Great Lakes. And I was really looking forward to that. And then the full scale kicked off, and I was like, well, I won't be able to look in the mirror if I don't hold true to my promise. So I came back, I've been here. And then the other, not to drag this on too long with my own personal perspective, but the other thing is I think this is the most important war of my lifetime. This is going to be a huge factor in determining whether the globe goes down a pathway of liberal democracy in one way, shape, or form, or goes down the way of autocracy. That's what is being fought over here, and it's not like there are going to be tanks on the Champs-Élysées, Russian tanks on the Champs-Élysées, or there's going to be a paratrooper from St. Petersburg standing guard outside of Buckingham Palace. But if they win in Ukraine, they can exert influence because of the inherent threat that they will pose, and that they're right on the doorstep with Western Europe. And that will change the dynamic of global politics. And it will affect Americans. Our oceans aren't going to save us anymore. We're in the 21st century. It doesn't work like that. They don't have to send ships or planes. They can attack us, in cyber attacks or information warfare. I really believe this is an important war for everybody on the planet, Americans included. So I've come here and basically brought the only skill set that I've got to contribute, because you put a gun in my hand and send me to the front lines, I'm a 54-year-old man. I'm fat. I'll shoot myself in the foot. I won't be good. I won't be any good to anybody. But I can sit here in this studio, and I can talk to people, and I can convey to a larger audience that this matters to you, and we're in an information war, and you're under attack inside your mind because Moscow knows they can't match us, toe to toe when it comes to military. Direct military confrontation. But what they can do is they can corrupt our body politic. They can exert their financial corruption and their kleptocracy. And they can simply change your perception of the world. They can gaslight you and conduct information warfare. Before we used to call it gaslighting, we used to call it a Potemkin village. There's a reason for that, man. The Russians have always been very good at this, at manipulating your perception of reality. And so I think we're on the front lines of a really important war, whether it's in the studio or whether it's on the front lines.
Yeah, I think so. I tell you, some of the best conversations I have about Ukraine are in my neighborhood. So I live in Bed-Stuy right now, and it's mostly black neighbor. A lot of black people live in Bed-Stuy, and my neighbor, another black man who's been on that block for 30 years, what have you, and anytime he stops me, he's like, man, tell me what's going on over there. And he's like, man, I go to the pool hall, and I'm like, I know this brother that go to Ukraine, and he lives there, so I ain't got to watch the news. I can just go and talk to him. And I feel like that's where I make the most influence, because I think what's important for us is that we talk to the people who are not in the think tanks. We talk to the people who are not converted. And so you talk about this information warfare is correct, especially when I talk to black people. The first things that they always bring up, and unfortunately, like there's some truth to it, talking about like the racism of Africans that faced the, when they were fleeing. Fine.
That's a complicated story.
It's a very and I've covered it's very complicated. But the problem is that they get a very one-sided version of what went down, and so I have to explain the complexity of it. First of all, like the racism that these people face, it wasn't just about Ukraine. I mean, when they go into the European Union, and it's actually a wider story there. So I just think that it really, if you really care about these people, you really are not doing them a service by just focusing on Ukraine. Because ultimately, what you tell people is that anytime something tragic happens, the worst in all of us comes out, no matter where you are. And adding on to that, we see what's happening in the United States. And so what I really push back on is making Ukraine the epicenter of racism and anti-blackness, where you have all this stuff happening across the world. And in the United States of America, there are literally ICE agents that are just literally scavenging the streets of the United States, just looking for people who are lawfully in the United States, and looking at their social media and saying, okay, well, this is grounds to deport you. People who've been naturalized, the same situation. And so I think that it is a Moscow trick to make Ukraine that percent of Nazism and the whole 9 yards. And so what I do is say, hey, bruh, yeah, I'm pretty sure that many, and in fact, I know for a fact that a lot of these African students who were fleeing experienced some racism. I've documented the stories, and I believe them. The real question is, why do you think that this is a very unique place, right? And again, it is complex, starting off with the reasons that there are, when you're going to the border, like there are a lot of ways that the lining up of people were not handled with particular care, et cetera. Like, so there are a lot of things you could look at, but also it's the laws that are set up for people who are leaving. And so that's just not a Ukrainian issue. So for example, it's not Ukraine's fault that refugees from the continent of people who are refugees, and if they're from the continent of Africa, they're treated differently once they enter into the European Union. Right. That's a wider European Union policy issue that supersedes anything that Ukraine could do. And so there's so many more things to it. And so I also tell people that I would not go to a country where I had to look to my left and look to my right for Nazis. I wouldn't go to a place voluntarily and be unsafe. So that is an icebreaker for a lot of people.
Well, and Moscow knows all of this. And so it tries to frame the narrative. It tries to put into a tidy little box that can be sold what's happening when the complexity is intense. And this is one of the criticism I have of my former, colleagues, not the guys who come here and do the actual news gathering. They're working within the limitations of the industry. But the American press corps has done a crappy job here. Yeah. Really shitty job of explaining. Everything is surface level. Everything is like, this is just, they'll go out to the front lines, they'll get a couple of moments of bang, bang, or they'll go to a refugee center, or they'll do this, that, or the other thing, but it's always on a surface level. And so it shouldn't come down to guys like you and me to really explain the complexities of here. But sadly, it kind of has.
Yeah, I think about when the Soviet Union broke up, some of the mistakes that were made. And I think the main thing, at least from the American side, was treating Russia, the newly formed Russian Federation, as this benevolent place. And so they just made this assumption that, okay, these people want democracy. And that is something that really perplexes me to this day, because even when people talk about Russia now, I mean, of course, it's quite obvious what they're doing here in Ukraine and elsewhere. But I think one of the biggest mistakes was assuming that Russia was going to turn into this democratic state. And also beyond the Budapest Accords, where they forced Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons, there's something else behind that, which is there was, even though officially the colonial state of the USSR ended, the West still treated Russia as a colonial colleague of sorts, right?
As a peer.
As a peer.
Yeah.
And so as opposed to really recognizing that in Russia and even with Yeltsin, who we know about him, he was widely viewed in Russia as a drunk, as somebody who people brought shame to the nation, and then Putin came along, who was
Well, and
initially collapsed it.
Yeltsin, when he tried to, the impression was he was trying to build democracy, but wasn't doing any such
Right.
thing. When the Duma, the legislature, basically the Russian parliament, tried to exert power in, I believe it was 1994, that's when he sent tanks to shoot at the parliament. Because they were trying to do a balance of power. He saw it as and I think a lot of people within the Russian power structure saw it as a way that the Duma was trying to regain control with the Communist Party, because they were the dominant party within the Duma. So that whole thing was a mess as well. But I think you're 100% right, and I say this all the time. I think we looked at the collapse of the Soviet Union with such hubris. Oh, we won. That's done. Okay, next thing. Global war on terror, Al-Qaeda, And we looked at it with such hubris that we thought we won the Cold War, so obviously our system of the rule of law and democracy and capitalism, that's going to go east. What actually happened was that when the Iron Curtain fell, the kleptocracy and the criminality and the imperialism and all the rest of it, that went west. They started buying mansions in London and Paris and New York. Their corruption fled west. Our system didn't go east, and I think we need to clarify that. The other thing that I think we screwed up with in the collapse of the Soviet Union is, instead of sending over modernizers and a kind of a post-Cold War what is at the end of the Second World War, we had the Reconstruction Fund.
Oh, you're talking about Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
We should have had a Marshall Plan for the former Soviet Union. Instead, what happened was a bunch of carpetbaggers went over there and stole anything, with the help of Russian oligarchs and criminal gangs. Anything that wasn't nailed down, we took, and that built resentment for the West. Mm-hmm. So we didn't do ourselves any favors there. But yeah, we mismanaged the entire collapse of the Soviet Union.
So Russian journalists Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogin, they actually have written a series of books that point to the fact that the Soviet Unions, even during the Russian Empire, Soviet Union in particular, they were studying Western capitalism and really, for more than a century, right, throughout their unions, the various forms of government. Because they knew that the West they loved capitalism, and so they actually exploited that and used it against us. And one of the things that the Russians really worked on and to exploit was the banking system. And so when you bring up the fact that they were buying property in the West and they were actually washing their money in London and Paris and elsewhere, they knew as one thing that they could look past is, when it came down to the morals of democracy and everything like that, is money. Mm-hmm. So if we can make money off of this, then the Americans, the Europeans, they're not going to pay attention to human rights. They're not going to pay attention to all these other subjects. And so they were, even during the USSR and the post-Soviet era, they were playing the West like a fiddle pretty well, because based on their own hubris that you brought up.
Nobody studies us more than the Russians, Americans in particular. Yeah. They're obsessed with us. In a larger picture, the Anglo-American alliance. Mm-hmm. That's because they have a real thing about the Brits as well, and their aggrievement that they feel towards the Brits. But they see America as their almost sole enemy on the planet. Mm-hmm. Certainly the primary one, and they study us meticulously. I mean, they know more about, your average Russian knows more about America than any American knows about Russia. Or, well, like 99% of Americans would know about Russia. They know how to play us. They know how to push on our pressure points, our divisions, are the things that separate and divide us, because they always work on divide and conquer. So that we hear these stories from, the 2016 election, or all throughout the kind of this Trump MAGA era, that they do things like they will organize a Black Lives Matter rally across the street from a Second Amendment rally, knowing that those two communities have a tradition of maybe clashing. Because again, it's divide and conquer. And they know our class divisions, our race divisions, regional divisions, divisions of thought about LGBTQ or liberal, conservative, and they use it against us. And that's aside from telling people about Ukraine, I also constantly am trying to convey to my Western English-speaking audiences, man, we're under attack, and they know how to pressure us to attack one another. And if you're into judo like Vladimir Putin, you know that using your enemy's own energy against itself is going to be more effective than maybe a direct confrontation.
Yeah, because I don't think that the Russians are particularly smart about like really deep diving into our culture at all.
They're deeply cynical and they look at it superficially. They don't understand the fundamental ideals of liberal democracy. And in fact, they find them naive and cynically kind of like rule of law. At the end of the day, it's all just about power.
Let me tell you this story about a journalist, our colleague from back in the 1930s and 40s, right? His name is Homer Smith, and he was born and raised in Minnesota. So he went to the Soviet Union. In his first year, he worked in a post office in Moscow. And he did this job because he wanted to be a foreign correspondent, but none of the publications that sent correspondents around the world would hire black people. So he took some job in the Soviet Union as a postal service person, then he would freelance on the side. And so eventually he got into a full-time job, and back in the day, they had the press, so it wasn't laptops and iPads like we use right now. So you had to know how to operate a press machine. And so Homer Smith went to the office one day, and the person who was running the press machine is not there. And so Homer Smith said, I know how to work the press. And his Russian colleagues were shocked. And they said, you know how to work the press? And Homer Smith said, yeah, but what about the racism and, you all have these segregated schools and the education of black people is low? And he said, well, yeah, that's true, but we have the black press. And we also have historically black colleges and universities. And so this Russian colleague was really saying that, well, this can't be true because most of you all are uneducated and you don't. He said, well, in certain parts of the country, that may be true, but we have our own press. But aren't you all restricted in your rights? He said, well, yes, but we do have the Constitution and we can't use it. And so we have hundreds of black newspapers where we can raise our voice, the Chicago Defender, et cetera. And so going back to this whole point of this very superficial look at the United States, Homer Smith saw that firsthand. And so Homer Smith just recorded this idea that, okay, these people really don't understand us.
At the very core of it, you're absolutely right. On my show, On the Edge, at the end of every episode, I include a statement from Abraham Lincoln, which was written in 1855, before the Civil War, in the lead up to the Civil War. He writes this letter to his childhood friend, Joshua Speed. I believe it's Joshua Speed. And he talks about a whole bunch of things. And basically he's, anti-slavery because Speed's a slave owner. And at the end of the letter, and this is the quote I use, and I'll paraphrase it, is we began this country's project by saying all men are created equal. We now say all men are created equal except for Negroes, foreigners, and Catholics. And if the know-nothings who believe in these things, which is basically they've always been with us, call them the know-nothings, call them the Confederacy, call them the KKK, call them MAGA, whatever you want to call it, this mentality of like we get to decide who's a true American and who isn't. If that kind of mentality ever takes over, I'd rather immigrate to a place like Russia where they don't even pretend to love liberty. And this is 1855, So I put that there for a reason because I don't think when Russians say, all you people who believe in liberal democracy, you're Americans who say you believe in freedom and yet look at your racial tensions and your inequalities that exist in America, to that my response is these are legitimate concerns and complaints and criticisms. What's the alternative you offer? Russia? What's your great scheme? And your great scheme is basically might makes right, and power is for power's sake. And then there's another story your story about your journalist in the 1930s. There's another wonderful story. It's not exactly connected, but I love it nevertheless. Have you ever heard the story of Taras Shevchenko met
Ira Aldrich.
Ira Aldrich, who had been born a slave, become free, and became a sensation on the stage. He was an actor.
Stage actor, yeah.
And they met. And so there's this great story about like a former, a slave of the Russian Empire in the form of a serf meeting a former slave from America. And apparently they got on famously. So
yeah, I remember.
It's like looking through a black mirror sometimes, or dark mirror. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, man. It absolutely is. Yeah.
It is because there are so many similarities between Russia and America, but the fundamental difference is, at least we're trying to get better. The Russians have no intention of doing it, and that's when you talk about them not understanding us in America or liberal democracy. It's because they don't understand the idea, or very few of them. It's the exception of the rule, those who believe that we can try to be better. And that's kind of what the American project is all about. Because the alternative Russia offers is just endless generations of, if you got power, you're in good.
You're in good, yeah, man.
And that's just, the larger fish eats the smaller fish, and that's all there's ever going to be.
And there's nothing in between. I want to talk about like the next 13, man.
Sure.
I'm really curious about Obama versus Trump and Obama. I'm sorry, Obama versus Trump and Trump versus Biden. Like thinking about like how Obama and Biden reacted to Russia. And then, and thinking about Trump, right? I always think that with Obama, I just think, honestly, he was just checked out in some ways. I wouldn't consider him weak. So a lot of people use the term weak. I think any person who decides that they're going to make the call to hunt down Osama bin Laden is not a weak person. I don't think he's weak. I think with Obama, I think that he severely underestimated the threat that Russia posed, and I think that he severely underappreciated how far spreading the Crimea illegal annexation would be for the rest of Europe. I really feel like when he came in, the reason why I push back against weak is that you remember that he came in after George W. Bush. And everyone was talking about no war. We're tired of the forever wars, right? And so you also remember that Obama said that I want to be the president to end nuclear weapons, to really retire all the nuclear weapons. I want to live in a nuclear-free world. But as we all know, in order for Obama to have done that, he really needed someone like Ronald Reagan, who I despise, but I think he has some solid Soviet policy. You needed a Mikhail Gorbachev. Somebody who said, okay, this is going to, so even though Gorbachev tried to make the Soviet Union work, he actually saw the writing.
Or a Thatcher.
Or a Thatcher.
Somebody who recognized the threat from Moscow.
Yeah, or a Thatcher, right? But Obama never had that.
No. And I think, and also, having his Secretary of State be Hillary Clinton was, her posture towards Russia was, I think, deeply mistaken. And maybe Obama shared, that same mentality, but the idea that we could just like normalize Russia. That there's the great moment of Clinton with the button, the restart button, which was actually embarrassingly was translated incorrectly. And Sergei Lavrov took no small glee in explaining that actually it was a wrong translation.
And whose English is actually incredible.
So I think the Obama administration made a lot of mistakes. I think you're right that this whole kind of like no more new wars, no matter what, and a lack of. You don't have to disrespect Russia because Moscow is so touchy about that kind of stuff, but neither can you just let them walk all over you. You got to find, you got to be tough with them. You got to stand.
What does
your
that
ground.
mean though? Because everybody doesn't know. Like everybody say you got to be tough, and I think people interpret that in such wide ways that I don't think we would.
Well, if you put a red line down, like Obama did in Syria, and it gets crossed, and you don't do anything about it, Moscow just goes, great, we know exactly where we stand. We can keep going. I mean, I remember covering that whole period when it was like there was somebody from the State Department and Lavrov was there and a journalist asked, what would it take for you to not attack Syria because of their chemical weapons program? And the American representative kind of glibly said, well, if they just got rid of all their, chemical weapons stockpiles and all the rest of it, then sure, thinking that like Syria would never do that. And Lavrov went, okay, we'll take them. We'll take them all. We'll get them out of Syria. Now you don't have any reason to bomb Syria. He just did a masterful end run around the U.S. State Department. You're right. But the Obama administration, I think, was played like a fiddle by Sergei Lavrov, who at one time was one of the best diplomats on the global stage, arguably still is.
Yeah.
The Obama administration, I think, did a lot of foreign. I was very critical of their foreign policy, the way they stopped the war. Not that they stopped the war in Iraq, but how they stopped the war in Iraq, leaving Afghanistan for future administrations to deal with. Again, their kind of like a willingness to look at, but look, for that matter, Bush did it too, this whole kind of like we can work with Putin sort of thing. Biden's administration, I think, was right in standing with our allies against Russia, but I agree with criticism that they weren't as supportive of Ukraine being able to actually win this war. I think they were the problem is post-Maidan 14 and through the Minsk agreements and all the rest of it. This isn't just America, but it's European powers. They're terrified of this situation. They're petrified. They're like deers in the headlights because the nuclear question, the question of what happens if Russia loses this war and the possible disintegration, what'll that mean? Migration, nuclear weapons, little fiefdoms fighting amongst themselves. The possibility of Russia losing fills these guys with dread. And yet at the same time, what does it mean for a sovereign Ukraine and a Ukraine that is now part of the European Union, which potentially could be a huge GDP and a large influence in Europe? This is, as I said earlier, this war is probably one of the most historically consequential that I will ever cover in my life. Touch wood, because the only other way is if we go into an open conflict with China. But I think the Biden administration made their mistakes. I was critical of them then, but I gave them some leeway because I thought there was some concern that if there was an overreaction or an escalation, which is what they said they were afraid of, that it would contribute to domestic politics and it would sweep Trump back in. Well, Trump got back in anyhow. So hindsight is 20/20. So I have my criticisms of Biden, but at the time I wasn't hypercritical. Was of Obama and the Trump administration. I think, sadly, and I know this gets me into tinfoil hat territory, I think the man is compromised. I really do. I think whether he's simply a fellow traveler with Vladimir Putin or whether or not he is acting in conjunction or if he's a useful idiot, one way or the other, the stuff he is saying and doing benefits Putin more than it does Ukraine. And I think that's on purpose. I think the man is compromised. I really genuinely do.
I don't think it's unreasonable.
How compromised? I don't know. I try to be careful with that because people get really like, you see Russians behind every tree. No, I don't. But I also know Russia and how it conducts information warfare. And make no mistake about it, we're under attack.
But it's also easy to make that assumption with somebody like Trump, who's a criminal. I mean, here's the thing. Putin and Trump, they're both criminals. Mm-hmm. The only difference between the two is that Trump is actually a convicted felon and Putin should be.
Yeah.
That's the only thing. I mean, the man belongs in The Hague, and he belongs behind bars for the rest of his life for what he's doing to Ukraine. That's the whole thing. They're both criminals. And it actually reminds me of our mayor in New York, Adams, another person who's compromised, right? A politician that's compromised. I mean, in this case, it's not the Russians, it's the Turks. It was the Turks, and then Trump pretty much gave him I don't know what the analogy would be, but hey, gave him a
get out of jail free pass.
Literally a get out of jail free pass, because I looked at that indictment. That man is guilty. Okay, but in short, it's easy to take people and who are compromised if they themselves are corrupted, and so you're dealing with these people who are criminals, and I think that's really the full cycle of all this. And
if Putin can drag you down to his level and compromise you that way, that's another way.
And that's the whole thing, right? And that's why we all should care about this stuff, because everything, even though I brought up Adams as his domestic, which is local New York City politics, you have people from around the world that look into our country and they say, if we can, in the case of Adams, fly him out someplace. And because it wasn't like Menendez over in New Jersey where he had gold bars and things like that from the Egyptians. Adams is so cheap, you just get him a first-class ticket and he'll just do whatever the fuck you want him to do, right? But then whereas with Trump, we don't know the full details, but given the fact that this man has been convicted of fraud and lying on his taxes and say like convictions, right? And particularly the other serious situation where he is civilly liable for assaulting a woman. Of course, these people are corrupted. My last question, man, is this whole thing about communicating Ukraine to Americans, because I think that's something that I'm always honing in and figuring out ways to really be meaningful. Because when the war first broke out, the big war, right, in 2022, this whole thing of will Kyiv fall or not? We know that, hey, we're in Kyiv right now in this studio and it's not going to fall, but I still think that in order to keep people engaged in what we both consider to be the most consequential geopolitical war, right, that will mean so much for the rest of the world. I'm curious about how do you engage our Americans back home to really care about this even a little bit, or as much as we do?
Well, the first thing is to humanize the Ukrainians, and not let the Russians define who Ukrainians are. I think that's really important for us to say these are not Russians. These are different people, different culture with different perspective and aspirations. They're not imperial like Russia is. They're not a global threat or anything like that. They're just seeking freedom and that this is an imperial and a colonial war. That's one of the most important things. The other important thing is to tell people that this will affect you. This will affect you because it will change the way Europe operates and the European market operates and how Americans relate. I mean, look at one of the number one things that Trump is trying to achieve is a split between Europe and America by saying that Europe have been freeloaders and all this kind of stuff. That plays right into what the Kremlin wants to have. We are stronger together, Europe and America, and we need to convey to our audiences that this isn't happening in a vacuum, that what happens here will have ramifications globally.
What happens with capitalistic societies like America, I think that what Russia realizes is that they tap into selfishness. Because one of the things about capitalism, it is inherently not a community-based,
Yeah, and they prey upon our weaknesses like greed and corruption and weakness, division, all of these kind of things. They play right into it, and it's all about destroying us. They have no interest in. Because they look upon the world as a null set. Everything is zeros and ones. It's binary. Somebody wins, somebody loses. They don't have, they hate us. They see the world as, certainly the ruling Russian elite, if it's bad for America, it's good for us, and vice versa. So look, man, we also, the other thing is that our media system is broken. Having worked within the media for years and years, we have a serious problem in that we don't have enough foreign correspondents. We don't have enough experts in a variety of different regions and topics. The way media is set up is very superficial. It's meant to be superficial. That's on purpose. It's meant to spark an emotional response long enough so that you can get to the commercials, or to get clicks and views. We need to be, as difficult as it is, explaining that there's so many complexities happening here. And I know that's a pain in the ass, because it's like I'm worried about what's happening at the factory because, my cousin works there and that matters to me. That's next door. But to look at the fact that there is a bigger picture happening here.
We're both guys from Michigan, though, man. At
Yeah.
the end of the day. So that's so the thing is about we could all have that same mindset.
Yeah. How do you explain that to a guy from Saginaw? That what happens in Mykolaiv is someday going to affect you.
So the way I do it, it is. But
it's
the way
Sisyphus, man.
It very much is. But the way that I do it is, I think at some point in my life, I realized that morally, we ought to be able to care about people other than ourselves. Mm-hmm. I genuinely believe that. And I think that people, I think what we see with the trade war that Trump is stupidly waging is that we've always had this assumption that no one can mess with us. And now we see that people can mess with us. Mm-hmm. People realize that our energy is not all produced here. There's this such thing as heavy crude and light crude. We're learning all this terminology and realizing that, okay, Canada sends us a particular type of crude oil. And if everyone talks about make everything in America, that means, well, okay, that's fine. So if you don't want, and it's very xenophobic, we don't want the quote unquote Mexican to take the job or the Chinese person to make the job. Well, over there, they're making your T-shirt for 50 cents. And if you want it made in America, let's really test your values, because now that T-shirt that costs $11.99 is going to cost $30, because you're going to have to pay that person in the factory in Ohio a living wage. And if it's a union job, you got to add that on to it. And so do you really want to invest in that? And I don't think people do. So I think, people are really realizing that the fact that we are consumers and we rely on the rest of the world to be our labor force. And so people can use all these different levers to push back against you. So I think that war, all those things manifest itself in that if we really are, being in Ukraine and being elsewhere, everyone thinks about the rest of us, but no one thinks about, in America, we don't spend that much time thinking about how the rest of the world can impact us. And I think with what Trump is doing right now, people clearly know that the world can't mess with us.
Yeah, 100%. And I'll just say two quick things about this, and I'll tread on some very tender territory as the quintessential white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Look, we had slaves.
Yeah.
We got rid of the slavery system. We bringing in Latinos to do cheap manual labor. Pretty soon we're going to have robots. So the white ruling class in America has always looked at a way for them to cheaply produce goods.
I don't think that's controversial. I think that's it.
Well, I'm always careful. I try to be careful because I'm about as white as they come.
It's not. It's just true. It's not controversial. It
is true, but also in addition to that, you're absolutely right in the fact that we need to recognize that people can mess with us, and that what happens here, what happens with a dominant Moscow, is ultimately going to affect you, whether you're in Saginaw or Santa Fe or wherever. It's time to wake up and recognize that the world is getting smaller and smaller, and you're absolutely right. I don't care what color, class, we're all on this little blue marble in the middle of the void, and we got to learn to live together, and we're all connected. And you can't just isolate yourself. Americans have done it for too long, and it's led to a lot of suffering. So I hope we can, you and I, at the very least, and the many others who do the same sort of thing, let people know that Ukraine's struggle is actually very connected to America.
we're going to try.
Yeah, we are. Thanks for what you do, man.
Thank you for what you do, man. Yeah,
We'll keep at it.
I will. You will too.
Thanks, bud.